Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. In this podcast, New York Times bestselling author Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute discusses her new book, Diversity Delusion. It's a provocative account of the attack on the humanities and sciences, the rise of intolerance, and the erosion of serious learning on our campuses and universities. Thanks for joining us. I'm here with Miss Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute. Heather graciously agreed to speak at a PRI luncheon in Newport Beach. Heather, your last book, The War on Cops, provided a rigorous analysis of data showing that it's crime, not race, that drives police actions and prison rates. Your new book, The Diversity Delusion, is similar in that it debunks the race victimization myth on university campuses. What was the genesis for this new book?
Well, the genesis, Rowena, was both sorrow and rage. I was fortunate to be in college in the 1970s before multiculturalism hit. So while I wasted a lot of time on a very crazy literary theory known as deconstruction, I still was allowed to read the greatest works of literature without anybody thinking to complain about the gonads and melanin of the authors. I regard that as one of the greatest privileges to have been able to spend 4 years immersed in sublimity, beauty, wit, profundity. In the 80s, long after I'd left college, identity politics started raging at a ferocious level, and students were taught that they could dismiss authors simply because the skin color and sex did not match themselves. They were given a license for ignorance. Faculty have been given the greatest job in the world to curate these great works and teach students why they should be down on their knees in gratitude before them. They have been either tongue-tied and silent before these outbreaks of ignorant student know-nothingism or are actively encouraging that sort of ignorant attack on greatness. So I'm deeply sorrowful that our obligation to keep our culture alive, to pass that inheritance between one generation to the next, is no longer being followed. And I'm also furious that people that have been given, the faculty that have been given such a great privilege, are abusing it.
So you got a front row seat on the hysteria happening on campus when you were invited to speak at Claremont McKenna College here in California. Please talk to our listeners about your experience there.
Well, I've been invited to speak about my book, The War on Cops, which argues that the Black Lives Matter narrative is completely false. We are not living through an epidemic of racially biased shootings, police shootings of black men. And I bear witness to the fact that in high-crime inner-city neighborhoods, the good law-abiding residents there are desperate for more police protection. They support the police. So I want to push back against what is, in fact, a very dangerous narrative because it resulted in another 3,000 black lives being lost to rising crime when the police backed off from necessary proactive policing under the weight of this false narrative. Well, a few days before I was supposed to show up to give my talk at Claremont McKenna, a call went out on Facebook to shut down the racist, fascist, Islamophobe, homophobic, white privilege, misogynist Heather McDonald. The students announced that Heather McDonald will not have a platform. So it's apparently up to students to decide who gets to speak and not. When I arrived on campus, I was brought into what was in effect safe house. I could hear the chanting and drumming growing louder and louder. I couldn't see it. It was outside of my range of vision, but it did put me in mind of what it must felt like at be an aristocrat of the French Revolution, where you hear the mob gathering force and you don't know what it's going to do. You know, obviously there's huge differences there, but it's one thing to read about student hysteria and it's another thing to be its target. So I was escorted through a secret passage into the auditorium where I was supposed to speak, not having seen or known that at that point about 200 students had surrounded the auditorium to prevent anyone from entering. The police, of course, were completely feckless. They stood down. They allowed the students to take over. They'd been given an order not to intervene by the campus authorities. So I gave my talk to an empty room. The students outside were pounding on the plate glass windows and chanting and drumming and shouting throughout. Finally, the law enforcement who were inside the building decided that they couldn't guarantee my safety any longer, and I was escorted out through the kitchen into a waiting Claremont police van and taken to the department.
Wow. The students did see your speech, so it was videotaped, isn't that right, or recorded?
Yes, it was live streamed, and I had answered 2 questions, and that's when the police shut the thing down.
That's really stunning. Now, our many California listeners may be very interested in what's become of Prop 209, and it's a ballot measure in 1996 in which Californians voted to end race and gender preferences in government and education. In your book, you detail how college administrators have tried to undermine Prop 209. Could you share what you found here?
Ward Connerly was one of the great visionaries of California politics and backed this far-seeing and absolutely necessary voter proposition that purported to end race and gender preferences in all throughout government operations, including the University of California and Cal State University. University of California, from the very start, was determined to be a scofflaw and not to follow, because it is now the religion of colleges to engineer diversity, by which they mean simply skin color. In order to do that, they need to have racial preferences which are vastly lowered admission standards for blacks and Hispanics, because otherwise not enough blacks and Hispanic high school students would qualify based on their academic qualifications alone for admission to the University of California. The rest of the state, other state agencies also kind of went along kicking and screaming, but they were surprisingly a little bit more obedient than UC was. So UC began crafting one workaround after another to try and pretend to be race blind, while in fact using surrogates for racial preferences. Things like holistic admissions, which purport to disregard test scores in favor of life experience, very broad, subjective criteria that allow a campus admissions officer to covertly import considerations of race. The UCLA Law School said, well, we're going to give preference to students who express an interest on their law school admissions application for something called critical race theory, which is a utterly bogus field of legal so-called scholarship that pushes back against the idea of objectivity and says that, well, it's enough for a law professor to talk about her personal experience intersectionally with racism and sexism in the United States to count as legal scholarship. UCLA Law School thought that, well, this would be a nice surrogate for bringing in black students. It turns out that white students who expressed an interest in critical race theory were denied admission, even though their grades were higher than the black students. So even that wasn't enough to satisfy the diversity maw. And since then, one of the last, probably the last, UC Regent, that is the Board of Trustees, the overseers of the University of California, with integrity, did a study of admissions at Berkeley and found that it was still vastly preferring blacks and Hispanics at the expense of, these days, above all, Asians and to a lesser extent whites.
To follow on that, you also discuss in your book the growing empirical evidence countering the claim that racial preferences in college actually benefit their recipients. If a student is in an academic environment that is beyond his or her capabilities, they often drop out. Could you talk about some of the current research in this area?
Yes, I think this is the most powerful critique of affirmative action of racial preferences. It's called Mismatch Theory. It has been brought to its most rigorous empirical manifestation by a liberal UCLA Law School professor, Richard Sander, who is very committed to the racial integration, but he's concerned that racial preferences actually work against that goal. And he analyzed tens of thousands of records of law students that was a part of a database created by a national law school association. And he found that blacks in law schools across the country, which are virtually every school is selective, are doing very poorly. After their first year of law school, 51% of black students end up in the bottom 10th of their law school class, compared to 5% white law school students after their first year. And 2/3 of black law students end up in the bottom 20% of their class. Blacks drop out of law school at twice the rate of whites. They fail to ever pass the bar at 6 times the rate of whites. And the reason for that terrible record in law school is that in virtually every case, law schools are admitting black students who are not competitive with their peers. They're so desperate to engineer racial diversity university that they reach down into the applicant pool to find blacks who, again, have LSATs, the law school admissions test, and grade point averages at least a standard deviation below the average of the school, and bring them in anyway. And what happens is they flounder. The teaching is geared towards the average student capacity, the skills, and that's not where black students are. This is not something that is confined to race. It would be the same with gender preferences. If MIT decided that it was going to engineer more gender equity in its incoming class and wanted more females, and admitted me, and let's say I had an SAT score in math of 650 on an 800-point scale, and all my peers were basically all perfect SAT scores in math of 800, my first year in freshman calculus, I'm going to really struggle, because the teacher will not be teaching towards me, he'll be teaching towards my peers who aced AP advanced calculus. Whereas had I gone instead of to MIT to a Boston College or a Boston University, all completely respectable schools, and my peers had SATs on their math, SATs of 650, I would thrive most likely, because I would be able to keep up. Teaching would be geared towards my capacity. So that's what we're seeing with blacks. Sanders concluded that we get fewer black lawyers because they drop out of law school so much than we would have if we got rid of racial preferences entirely.
Now, one of my favorite chapters in your book is titled Microaggression Farce, where you write about the victimology culture that's now prevailing on campuses. Can you give our listeners some of these crazy examples?
Well, the whole concept of microaggressions is an implicit admission that we've run out of actual racism to get upset about. So instead, you have the race activists and the victimologists struggling to come up with ways to be offended and to try to keep this narrative going that the thing that is keeping blacks down is white racism. So the University of California president, Janet Napolitano, formerly the head of ICE or the INS, came up with a list of microaggressions that the UC faculty were not supposed to use, and if they did, they would allegedly be putting their students of color at risk of academic failure. Things that you're not allowed to say is, I believe that America is a land of opportunity. When I see you, I don't see your color. I believe in treating everybody fairly. I believe in hiring by merit. All of these things are said to be microaggressions, and one can question what the theory is. I mean, if it's a microaggression to say I believe in hiring by merit, is the assumption that we all know that there's preferences are so ubiquitous that if you hire by merit, that means you're not going to be hiring blacks. It's a very odd implicit acknowledgement of the sad state that we're in this country. And students went around creating little videos about their own being assaulted by microaggressions. And one of the favorite ones was the phrase, "So like, what are you?" The context for this being at a freshman mixer when somebody comes up to somebody and says, "So like, what are you?" Meaning, you tell me that you're Samoan, Japanese, Nigerian, Swedish mix. So what is that exactly? Well, it's really ironic. Consider this a microaggression in a world where we've been told that the most important thing about somebody is his race or ethnic identity. So we shouldn't be surprised if students question that. But nevertheless, this will be another reason for students to go storm the president's office and demand exemption from going to class or studying for exams, because they're focused, as students say at Brown and Yale, on staying alive on that racist college campus.
Now, turning to a topic that interests me as an Asian American and other Asian Americans here in California is a case where Harvard is being sued by Asian student applicants who got top grades and top scores and are active in their community and have many extracurricular activities, but they didn't get in. What's your take on this?
Well, the situation of Asians is very interesting on many political grounds. It is absolutely true that Asians are the most handicapped by racial preferences because they are whooping everybody's ass. They've got an academic culture that is so intense. The students are so focused on learning, on becoming successful, competitive academically that they put everybody else to shame. And so admissions is zero-sum. The colleges, Harvard tried to dance around that fact, but every time that you set a place aside for a underqualified Black or Hispanic students, that's one less place for somebody who is competitive academically and would have been admitted on his academic qualifications, but for the regime of racial preferences. So Asians, and this has been true for a long time now, Asians are the most handicapped by this. Schools have basically set ceilings on the number of Asians that they will admit. The few academic institutions that do not have racial preferences, places like Stuyvesant High School in New York City, which is a public school that admits based on a colorblind objective entrance exam, or Caltech, say, they have their percentage of Asians in their incoming classes is about 40 to 70%. So you would think that Asians would be uniformly united in opposing racial preferences. And some are. The lawsuit against Harvard for its ceiling against Asians was brought. The plaintiffs are a bunch of Chinese American groups, and at Stuyvesant High School in New York City, which has been under enormous pressure for decades to start admitting by race rather than meritocracy. It's the Chinese American parents there that are fighting that most vociferously. Nevertheless, what's interesting to me is that there are lots of Asians who have decided to throw in their towel with the race victimologists. And Harvard brought defense witnesses to the lawsuit that were Asian students who they'd gotten into Harvard. That they've got one less reason to be upset with the racial preferences regime. But nevertheless, they should be able to look at this objectively and say, even though they got in, and one student who was profiled by the New York Times, of course, he had his distinguishing feature in that he was questioning his gender identity. So that probably got rid of the Asian handicap and got him into a more full-fledged victim category. But what I see happening, which is very odd, is that a lot of Asians have decided they want to be considered persons of color or students of color, which is the official oppressed category on college campuses. And, we've heard the mantra since the 1990s, well, don't call us a model minority. Don't tell us that we're successful. We want to be floundering just like everybody else. Again, very odd. Rather than embracing their success, these elite Asians understand that in American culture today, the most prestigious thing you can be is a victim. And even though you rightly point out, Rowena, that in one sense, the successful Asians who are not admitted to schools, even though they qualify for them because they're losing spots to affirmative action beneficiaries, they are, in a sense, victims. But the more politically powerful way of being a victim is to claim that you're a victim of white oppression. And there's plenty of college graduates, highly educated Asian students that are playing that card because they don't want to be seen as allied with whites. They want to be seen as allied with students of color. The irony there is that even they're saying, no, we're students of color too. Please don't think of us in the white category. The university administrators are saying, no, you're not students of color. We are not going to we don't use you to get our diversity points up. We're going to discriminate against you to admit the real students of color who are blacks and Hispanics. This summer there was a flurry in the conservative media over a woman whom the New York Times had hired to be on its editorial board to write about technology, Sarah Zhang. She was a Asian, I can't remember if she was a Harvard graduate or a Berkeley graduate, but highly educated. She had a long Twitter trail of just outright venom directed at whites. And she was playing all of the microaggression cards, all of the intersectionality cards. She is a very perfect exemplar of the left-wing Asian college graduate that we're seeing more and more of. And it's a real shame because, frankly, Asians have the most to gain by a system of colorblind meritocracy.
Those are great points, Heather. One of the most disturbing trends that you write about in your book is how identity politics is now beginning to creep into the sciences because of the tremendous pressure to increase representation of females and blacks and Hispanics to STEM fields. Qualifications for admissions in these areas of study are being reevaluated. Silicon Valley is where it is today because it's hire the best and the brightest. If this trend persists, you write that over time we could lose our innovative edge over other countries like China, for example.
Yes, there was a lot of optimists who thought that, well, this diversity stuff is just nonsense. It's patently crazy. But there's firewalls in our culture. One suggested firewall was for the free market, corporations. They'd never do anything crazy like boycott North Carolina because of their trans law, that says that boys can't use girl bathrooms. Well, that was wrong. It turns out corporations have been completely infiltrated by identity politics. The other firewall was said to be around the sciences, that surely nobody's going to presume that science is color or gender coded and that you need to be a certain color in order to do good science. Well, that too was a naive hope. The National Science Foundation, which is our premier government funder of basic research, is now committed to the idea that the only good science is diverse science. It's spending billions of taxpayer dollars funding gender studies theorists to study intersectionality in engineering and mathematics, all to try and explain why there isn't 50-50 gender parity, males and females. The reason that there is not is that males have different risk preferences, drives for competition. They prefer more abstract, ideas-based work. Females prefer more hands-on relational work. And at the very outer extremes of math stupidity and math brilliance, males predominate over females at the high end at a rate of 2-to-1. So there's no reason to see that the science fields, just because of the fact that they are not in some of the more abstract realms like physics and math, just because they're not 50-50 gender equal, that does not mean that they're discriminating. In fact, there's not a single science department in the country that is not twisting itself into knots to hire and promote females at rates vastly ahead of males. But this preference for the irrelevancies of race and gender in science, something that is completely unrelated to whether somebody has the capacity to think through the mysteries of cancer or Alzheimer's disease. As long as we continue down this path, which is to not hire the most qualified if they happen to be white or Asian male, is absolutely going to put our scientific edge at risk.
Do you think there's hope in bringing back universities to places of learning where students learn the great philosophers, writers, poets, and composers? What are steps that we can take to be sure that future generations learn and understand what makes great civilizations and the societies thrive?
Well, it's a real conundrum of how to break the college monopoly. Many parents want their kids to be credentialized in the most prestigious manner possible, and for sure, alumni should not give any money, don't give another damn cent to your university unless you are 100% confident that it is not promoting victimology, that it has not destroyed the canon with oppression studies, grievance studies. There are schools that are still committed to a non-politicized deep dive into greatness and beauty, the St. John's schools, University of Dallas, which I've never been to. And there's other talk of, I know Jordan Peterson, I've read that he is thinking of starting a humanities school. I know a young man who's trying to do something in the South that would be also based in the Western civilization's extraordinary inheritance of thought and artistic creation. But if you are determined to send your children to college, and I myself am reluctant to pull the plug because I still have this ideal of an ivory tower education, just make sure that you're watching what he takes his classes. Now, of course, the chances are is that any college student today is going to be absolutely mandated to take grievance studies. The faculties do not summon the intellectual courage to say, well, you've got to read courses in the American founding or European history or 19th century American literature or Renaissance drama. They will not say that. But what they will say is you have to take courses in gender studies and intersectionality or post-colonialism. So there's a certain amount of this that is impossible to avoid. But when your student is not filling these ridiculous identity-based course requirements, scour the catalog and try to find classes that look substantive. Steer them away from film classes, please. I mean, this is, you do not need to go to college to take courses in film. Go for things that he is unlikely or she is unlikely to read for the rest of his life.
Now, finally, our last question, Heather. PRI is a stone's throw away from wine country, and most everyone enjoys drinking wine at PRI. And in fact, we're recording this interview at the Pacific Club's wine cellar. So it's our tradition that we ask every podcast guest for a wine, cocktail, or beer recommendations. What adult beverage are you enjoying these days as you celebrate the launch of your new book?
Well, actually, to be honest, Rowena, I was banned from drinking seltzer water over the summer by my dentist, which was very trying for me, especially in the summertime. So when I want to feel really naughty, I have a glass of seltzer with lime. But near to where I grew up in Los Angeles, there's the Moraga Vineyards, founded actually taken over by Rupert Murdoch. And I find that it has some surprisingly good wines that are out there.
Thanks so much, Heather. Thanks to our guest, Heather McDonald. Her new book, Diversity Delusion, is available on Amazon.com, and Heather's essays and other work can be found at the Manhattan Institute website and City Journal. A few announcements. On February 28th, PRI is holding a day-long policy conference in Sacramento, followed by, of course, wine tasting. And on Saturday, March 23rd, Tucker Carlson will be our keynote speaker at our 40th anniversary gala in San Francisco. Details for both events are on our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.